For as long as humans have told stories, we've told stories about fathers and sons, but they rarely look like the story of John Cashmore. One of 11 kids and an elementary school dropout, Cashmore strove to make a name for himself despite his humble beginnings, and he did. He built a successful business manufacturing office furniture, then took that money and turned his attention to politics, where he served as the borough president of Brooklyn, New York for over 20 years. His path in life gave him the sorts of power and connections most people can only dream of, but it didn't leave much time for his son James. Of course, John did his best to provide for his family, using the resources and access afforded by his job to help open doors for James so he could have the same opportunities he'd fought so hard for, but the two of them never really learned to communicate. By some accounts, they rarely spoke to each other even when they were in the same room. There was no real animosity between them, but there didn't seem to be much else either. And all this might just have been the internal gossip of a mildly dysfunctional family if James hadn't married a woman named Sandy Gaston. A teacher and a poet, Gaston watched James and John's relationship with equal parts fascination and concern as she saw the damage it did to both of them in their own ways. Eventually, their marriage ended and Gaston went on to remarry, this time to her guitar teacher, Harry Chapin. Gaston, now Sandy Chapin, would often help her new husband write songs, showing him her poems so he could put them to music. And after hearing a song on the radio that reminded her of John, she was inspired to write something down to try to capture that feeling, not of loss exactly, but of having failed to build anything worth losing in the first place. At first, Harry wasn't interested, but after missing the birth of their own first child, Josh, he found himself drawn back to that poem. He finally understood what it was trying to say, and it scared him half to death. That poem was, of course, the foundation for Cats in the Cradle, a song that, despite what you may have heard, is not by Cat Stevens. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. And the first thing I notice is what's missing. This riff contains every single note of the scale except the third. And the third note is arguably the most important one because it's the one that tells us if the key we're in is major or minor. Without it, we have to go looking for other clues, but in this case, those clues are contradictory. Like after the big perfect fifth leap at the beginning, the next thing we hear is a prominent D natural on a strong beat, which clearly indicates major, especially with that 5-6-5 neighbor tone thing he's doing. That particular melodic decoration is reminiscent of nursery rhymes like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star or the Alphabet Song, and it gives the riff this warm, welcoming sort of tone. On the other hand, the second bar leans heavily on E flat, the minor seventh, driving it back to the root with a technique called encircling, where you approach a target note by playing the notes above and below it. The repeated E flat, and especially the resolution from there back to F, gives it a dark, minor sort of weight. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying the tonality is ambiguous. We get a pretty clear answer a couple bars later from a pentatonic string line including A flat. Combined with the rest of the notes, this puts us in the Dorian mode, or minor with a major sixth, and since this riff repeats throughout the song, when we hear it, we usually already have that context. It's a minor melody, or at least a Dorian one, so instead of ambiguous, I'd call it ambivalent. The point isn't the missing third itself, the point is how that missing third highlights the clash between the major sixth and minor seventh. If the tonality was more clearly established, then one of those two notes would feel like it was encroaching on the other's emotional landscape. In this case, the major sixth is crashing a minor party. But by avoiding the third entirely, it puts them both on equal footing, embracing the cognitive dissonance at the heart of the Dorian sound. And that ties in beautifully with the story of the song. You've got the bright, major happiness of the idealized family, and the dull, minor sadness of conflict and loss, but all of it is built on this hollow foundation that leaves the listener emotionally disconnected from that turmoil. It feels too late to really feel anything. Of course, there's no chords here, and there's also no drums, which makes it hard to catch this next thing. Somewhere in the intro is a bar of 3-4. Where exactly is mostly a question of notation, but if you count along, there's only 15 beats before the verse, so somehow he must have dropped one. And the reason it's hard to pin down where is that the entire time feel gets a bit slippery. After the riff, Harry settles into a sort of galloping arpeggio that hits all the beats pretty evenly without doing anything special to mark out a particular bar line. On top of that, the cello plays a 5-beat melody that's flexible enough that any of these notes could potentially be the downbeat if you wanted to hear it that way. Point is, between the end of the riff and the start of the verse, there doesn't really seem to be a meter. The guitar and cello are just dancing around each other, following a shared pulse and not worrying about the larger metric structure. I'm hesitant to assign too much meaning to it, because folk music just kinda does this sometimes, but once you hear it, it does start to feel like the story of the song is like interrupting other more important things. And that carries through into the verse, which approaches the same feelings as the riff, but from a slightly different musical perspective. On the surface, it's really straightforward question and answer style melody writing, with a first half that hangs around the fifth,
"A child arrived just the other day,"
to imply further motion, and then a second half that falls back to the root,
"He came to the world in the usual way,"
for a complete sense of closure. But looking closely, there are some interesting parallels with the first bar of the riff. Both lines start with the same perfect fifth leap up,
"Child arrived,"
and the vocal melody even mirrors that interval by ending with a perfect fifth leap back down.
"usual way."
In between, we see similar note choices. After the C, both lines work their way down to B flat to create momentum and contrast. But as similar as the overall shape is, there's something pretty important missing. In the verse, the entire phrase takes place in the range between that root and fifth. It never goes up to the sixth or down to the seventh, cutting out a lot of the important color tones of the scale. In fact, beyond this one little 16th, the whole thing is tetratonic, which is a term I just made up to describe a melody that uses only the four notes that are shared between the major and minor scales. It's got roots, fourths, fifths, and seconds, but none of those tell us much about how we're supposed to feel, so it comes across as calm, but kinda detached. Which is wild, considering the lyrics. In the very first line, we witness the miraculous creation of life, but the formulaic and tonally empty melody puts that on the exact same level as, like, paying bills. These are both just things that our protagonist has to deal with, and he'd kinda rather not. And let's talk about those lyrics. Catch in the Cradle started as a poem after all, so it seems only fair to acknowledge Sandy's poetic craft. The story is, of course, not very subtle, but there are a lot of little flourishes she throws in to create the right atmosphere. One of my favorites is right here in the opening lines, where she describes the child arriving in, quote,
"The usual way."
And look, I've never given birth, so maybe I just don't get it, but that seems like a really casual way to describe what, to the best of my knowledge, is actually a pretty involved process. It's the sort of language that, without ever explicitly saying so, makes it easy to assume that the singer wasn't in the room when it happened. And he also doesn't seem to connect very much with the baby. Some live performances have Harry singing "My Child Arrived," but in the studio version, it's just a child. He doesn't even acknowledge the parental connection until later in the verse, when that child finally calls him dad. And on the technical side, the rhyme scheme is built on a simple quatrain with 4 lines ending with the same rhyming syllable: day, way, pay, and away. I don't have much to say about that yet, but keep it in mind, because I'm definitely gonna have some things to say about it later. Underneath that, the lush strings and twanging electric sitar of the intro are gone. The vocals are accompanied only by Harry's guitar, playing these finger-style arpeggios with a capo on the 8th fret. We tend to think that the point of a capo is to change the key, and yeah, that's true, but it also does a lot more. A capo, especially a really high one like this, fundamentally changes the character of the guitar by changing its register. The lowest notes in the voicing are still really high, which makes the instrument sound brighter and a bit tinny. It's like how if I talk real low and then pitch shift my voice back up, it doesn't really sound like if I was just talking normally. All the subtle warmth of my lower register is gone, carried up along with the rest of the frequencies. So even though the pitch is the same, the tone is higher. And the same thing happens with Harry's capo, especially since, as far as I can tell, he rarely uses the low E string. The lowest note I hear him play is this E flat on the 11th fret, almost an octave above the lowest note he could play, and that gives his guitar this light, airy quality that both contrasts and complements the main melody. In music, the best way to create a sense of melancholy is usually to juxtapose light and dark elements. The darkness here comes from the minor melody and the slower, ballady tempo, and while some of the lightness does come from the fact that the F chords he plays are major, I don't really hear that as a very big factor. To me, the brightness of the high capo, along with Harry's energetic, enthusiastic finger-picking style, is what creates the sort of happy, nostalgic vibe that gives the listener something to be wistful about. That leads into the tag, and once again, the melody borrows its basic structure from the riff, this time looking like an elongated version of the second bar. And that means something very important, because it means we see the return of the flat 7. I mean, it never fully went away away. It was in some of the chords during the verse, but now it's back in the melody because he's doing the same encircling thing again, approaching the root from the notes on either side.
I'm gonna be like you.
Like before, this creates a solid sense of closure and landing on that F, but if we really want to talk about landing, we have to look at this melody in the context of the other main part in this section, Don Payne's bass. This is a new instrument, adding a lot of extra weight to contrast the lightness of the high capo guitar, and it must be pointed out that this heavy, sobering sound comes on the exact line where the child first calls the narrator Dad. That specific word is also the first time we hear Harry's voice drop down to a low C.
I'm gonna be like you, Dad.
So clearly this is a moment that he takes very seriously. Again, keep that in mind. Anyway, Payne's just walking down the scale, but he starts on the 7th, not the root, giving the section a bit of forward momentum by immediately putting it in motion. This sort of slow downward walk is often used to create a sense of regret, sinking gradually toward its inevitable conclusion. In it, we can hear the months and years slipping by as Harry sings about his son growing up without him. At first, the lines are largely unconnected. The vocals flitter back and forth between the root and 2nd, staying largely steady while the bass drifts down.
Talking for a new it, and as he grew, he'd say,
but as they cross the bar line, the two melodies start to collide, each approaching the final root in its own way. The encircling in the voice is echoed and harmonized by a scalar walkdown.
I'm gonna be like you.
And ultimately, they arrive at the same place at the same time, resolving to F on beat 3 from both directions simultaneously for an extremely complete sense of closure. That's why I'm calling this section a tag, not a pre-chorus. The point of a pre-chorus is to ramp up into a chorus, but this bit doesn't do that. Instead, it wraps up the verse, concluding that chapter of the story so we're ready to move on. And as if that's not a solid enough ending, he even doubles down, playing it again and repeating the lyric,
I'm gonna be like you, Dad. You know I'm gonna be like you.
To make absolutely certain you get the point. That said, the chorus isn't entirely unprepared. As he sings the final line, a whole string section starts to swell, culminating in a half bar of big chord stabs on a high F major, joined by Alan Schwartzberg's drums.
Know I'm gonna be like you. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon,
marking the drastic shift in orchestration that accompanies the chorus. We've gone from the relatively sparse singer-songwriter palette of the verse into a full rock complement, a string section, and a choir, all of which makes this feel to me like the intrusion of an omniscient narrator. We're no longer hearing from the father's perspective. Instead, we're getting a bird's-eye view of the whole story, as if we were watching it on TV, which highlights that ultimately, this song is effectively a parable, with a specific moral message it intends for you to take. The details of that story are in the verse, but the chorus's haphazard mishmash of imagery from various nursery rhymes gives it all a sense of esoteric knowledge, positioning Harry as a sage, inviting you to consider the lesson of his protagonist's mistakes. Melodically, there's not a lot of motion here. With the added harmonies on top, Harry is content to sit pretty still, mostly alternating between F and E flat, depending on which one matches the current chord.
and the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon. Little boy blue and the man on the moon.
With just a little decoration whenever he moves in order to give it a bit more contour. The choir comes in and out as needed, emphasizing certain moments while leaving him to sing others on his own, but the big payoff comes at the end of the chorus. Here, the vocals and bass echo their patterns from the tag, with the vocals once again encircling the root while the bass walks from 3 down to 1.
We'll get together then. You know we'll have a good time then.
They repeat this twice, with the choir singing along the first time, then laying out the second, and this figure once again provides a sense of narrative closure that stands in sharp contrast to the lyrics. He's singing about making plans for the future, but the music says those plans will never really come to fruition. And that's the unspoken tragedy of the song. Both father and son want to spend time together, but they both know that time will never actually come. There'll always be something in the way. After the chorus, the riff comes back as a little interlude, with a couple more instruments carrying through, including the bass and, more importantly, the drums. That means we finally get some hints at the metric structure, and it's weird. It's mostly just quarter note kicks to keep the beat, but Schwartzberg occasionally does this little hi-hat splash. And if we assume these mark the last beat of each bar, then we've got a bar of 4-4, then 5-4, than 2/4. And that actually kinda makes sense. There's no string line here, but if we take this and look back at the intro, what we basically have is an 8-beat guitar line, then a 1-beat pause, and a 5-beat cello line with another 1-beat pause before the verse. That could easily sort itself out into bars of 4, 5, 4, and 2 beats each. That even puts all the most important notes in all the phrases on the downbeats, so yeah, sure, let's say it's that. I don't really know what this analysis accomplishes, but I like pointing it out because in rock and metal circles, we often treat constantly changing meter as like the pinnacle of rhythmic complexity. It's a thing that technical virtuosos do to show off their prowess, but here's Harry Chapin changing time signatures 4 times in 4 bars, and you probably didn't even notice. It just sort of flows because the rhythms are in direct conversation with the phrasing of his melodies, and that, I think, is honestly a lot more impressive. Fight me in the comments. The second verse is similar to the first, again with the addition of Payne and Schwartzberg. This thickens up the sound and takes a bit away from that high capo brightness I talked about, but the guitar itself is still up in that register, so I think the effect still works. It just feels a bit more serious now. It's also helped out by the drums. In the chorus, Schwartzberg played a pretty dull, low-tuned snare, but here he switched to a cross stick that cuts through with its own wooden sort of brightness. And lyrically, we're seeing a theme develop. Much like in the first verse, the opening line here ends with the phrase, "Just the other day." This ties the verses together, and it sets a very specific perspective through which their stories are heard. They're always just a little in the past, recent but not current, which is where the most painful regret lives. It's too late to go back and play ball with your son on his birthday, but it's not so late that you have any real distance from it. You just missed your shot. And the specific wording of this recurring line also creates a sense of detachment, as if the narrator doesn't quite care enough to know exactly when these events transpired. They're, the other day. And poetically, it once again sets up a simple quatrain, this time rhyming day, play, today, and okay. It even uses the same A sound for its rhymes that the first verse did. Continue to keep this in mind, it's gonna pay off soon. In fact, I don't have a lot new to say about the second tag or chorus, so let's just pay it off right now with a skip to the third verse. This is where the story starts to change. So far, the father hasn't been able to make time for his son, but now the son's starting to grow up, and it's his turn to not have time for his father. Musically, the changes here are a bit subtle. The accompaniment is basically the same as the second verse, but there are still some clear signals that something's different. Like, remember in the tag when Harry used that low C, "I'm gonna be like you, Dad," to emphasize the son's admiration for his father? This time he doesn't do it. "What I'd really like, Dad, is to borrow the car keys." The son rejects his father's gesture as too little too late. He's built his own life that doesn't involve him. All he wants is the only thing his father's ever given him. Stuff. He'll get his emotional support from the people who've actually been there. But I promised a resolution to that quatrain thing, didn't I? So, okay, the third verse starts the same as the others. "Well, it came from college just the other day. So much like a man, I just had to say," with an opening couplet using the same A rhyme, but this time it breaks. "Son, I'm proud of you. Can you sit for a while?" He shook his head and he said with a smile. Instead of a full quatrain, we get 2 unconnected couplets, and this new rhyme marks the moment where a new voice enters the story. The son isn't a child anymore. He has agency. He gets to make his own choices, and we're hearing him choose to start pulling away. He's becoming his own person, and the changing rhyme scheme is him becoming an equal participant in the telling of his story. And before you run to the comments to tell me I'm reading too much into this, I've got even more to say about it later, so just keep on keeping it in mind. And then a long time passes. Narratively, not musically. Musically, we get another chorus, but instead of the riff, it ends with this massive string fanfare. And there's a lot to talk about here, mostly centered on one specific choice. The D-flat chord. Again, throughout the song, we've been hearing D naturals, not super often, but enough to clearly point our ears toward Dorian. But here, in this moment, we get a taste of natural minor. What does it mean? Well, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, the scale has become darker, but on the other, the chord itself is major. Writing minor progressions that emphasize the scale's major chords, like D-flat and this E-flat here, is a great way to make a minor song sound hopeful. We've already seen him doing that with the A-flat chord throughout the verses and choruses, so this feels less like a sudden flash of sorrow, and more like an extension of that harmonic vocabulary. It's a triumphant moment, especially with that major F chord at the end. If anything, he went full minor because in this particular moment, Dorian wasn't major enough, and that's really cool. Narratively, it feels a bit like a changing of the guards. Up to now, the father's schedule has been the main barrier to the two characters bonding, but as he moves toward retirement and his son enters adulthood, they kinda switch roles. Except now it's even worse. At least in the early verses, they presumably lived together, so when the father was home, they could talk face to face, and we did see them doing that a couple times. Now though, the son's moved away, first to college and then with his new family. Without a shared physical space, they can only exist in each other's lives if one of them makes an active effort to connect, which neither of them ever really learned to do. So they don't talk, and they grow distant, which manifests as a breakdown before the last verse, where nothing happens for a couple bars and the energy of that fanfare just drains away completely. And then we get the last verse, and this is where everything comes full circle. Or not. Bear with me. First, we once again see two unconnected couplets, and again, they use the same vowels as before, starting with a rhyming A.
I've long since retired, my son's moved away. I called him up just the other day.
And then responding with I.
I said, I'd like to see you if you don't mind. He said, I'd love to, Dad, if I can find the time.
And again, I don't know if this was intentional, but the parallels are hard to ignore. They've effectively given each character his own narrative voice, and you can tell whose perspective is in control by which vowel the line ends with. Early on, the father is making all the decisions, the son is passively accepting them, and the rhyme scheme is consistent and simple. As the son grows, the father still tries to dictate the relationship on his terms, but now he's met with pushback because his son has learned to live his own life, and the rhyme breaks off into a more fragmented shape. It's beautifully done. The meter also changes here. At the end of each two-bar phrase, they add an extra half bar without any melody.
Long since retired, my son's moved away. I called him up just the other day. I said,
as another sign of just how much they've grown apart and how awkward they feel talking to each other. It communicates at a deep, visceral level the hesitation and discomfort the father feels at the idea of having an honest, vulnerable conversation with his own son, and the son's uncertainty about how to handle his father reaching out to connect after all these years. The verse ends on a tag like normal, but then instead of the chorus, they play the tag again, this time in a stripped-down form with most of the instruments removed.
And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me, he'd grown up just like me.
And it's the saddest line in the song because no, he didn't. I mean, look, we don't know much about the son's adult life, and he's a fictional character, so we can't really ask questions that aren't answered by the text, but listen carefully to the reason he gives for not being available.
You see, my new job's a hassle and the kids are the flu, but it's sure nice talking to you, Dad.
Did you catch it? He can't make time for his estranged father because he's busy taking care of his own kids. And his father doesn't seem to realize the significance of this. Heck, I'm not sure if the Chapins realize the significance of this. Maybe they did it on purpose, or maybe flu was just a good rhyme for you, but whatever the reason, literally the only thing we're told about this man is that he's broken the cycle. He's learned the lessons of his father's failures, and his father can't even tell. And that is, in a way, the final brick in the wall that separates them. The father's too wrapped up in his past mistakes to understand what his son needs now. And I feel like the son knows that, and he's accepted it thanks to one final musical detail. When he tells his father it was nice talking to him,
but it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you.
The low C is back, which means he means it. He's come full circle, seeing his father for who he is, and choosing maybe not to trust him, but to love him anyway, flaws and all. At least, that's how I like to hear it. Now, if you don't mind, I'm gonna go call my dad. That feels like the right thing to do. And hey, thanks for watching. Thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewart, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, Neil Moore, Jeff, and Michael Mole. Check out the Nebula cut for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.